everyone, I'm Gabrielle Gewirtz, and today I will be analyzing the partitions of 1947 and 1971 through a gendered lens. Before I start, I wanted to provide a trigger warning for sexual violence and suicide, because both topics are heavily talked about during this presentation. So for countries, partition can be defined as dividing territory along ethno-religious or linguistic lines. In many cases of partition, violence is prominent because there are mass deportations that make those involved in partition angry to be leaving the land that they once called their home. In the case of the 1947 partition between India and Pakistan, as the British were decolonizing India, a partition was put into place to divide the land along ethno-religious lines so that there would be a Hindu majority state that would become India and a Muslim majority state that would become Pakistan. Widespread communal violence once again arose in East and West Pakistan, what became known as Bangladesh and Pakistan. A movement for Bengali nationalism in East Pakistan due to linguistic differences led to a mass amount of violence. What came out of the agreement that emerged was the partition of East and West Pakistan, with East Pakistan becoming a predominantly Bengali-speaking state. As seen from both of these partitions, communal violence was common. This was especially the case for women, where millions were raped and abducted. To provide a statistic that shows the drastic number of women that were affected, during the partition of 1947, about 83,000 women were abducted, and only 30,000 of these women were found. In the 1971 partition, a number of women were also kidnapped. One woman who was present for the 1971 partition, named Ashoka Gupta, remembers that nobody knows that the people that went missing, the whereabouts of little daughters, sisters, and wives. This quote encapsulates the fear that was prevalent amongst women during these times and shows that women were in fact targeted during both partitions. Women tended to be one of the main targets for violence because of their relation to honor and purity in society. Women were considered a symbol of purity for their communities. With the violence that occurred during both partitions, as women were physically harmed, they became known as impure, which then also impacted their families and communities, who were societally known to be dishonored. Women, therefore, were mostly on the receiving end of violence, which led to a loss of agency on their behalf. My presentation will focus on 4 categories that cover some of the ways that these women lost their agency, which I found when reading primary and secondary accounts of women's stories. These categories include how women were regarded as symbols of land and purity, mass suicides by women, how communities reacted to these women as mothers, and how women were reintegrated into their former communities and families after kidnappings and sexual violence took place. The goal of this presentation is to put women at the forefront of the narrative of partition. I wanted to share this quote that encapsulates why I chose this topic. Locate a perspective that sees women at the intersection of the interplay of forces and not at the periphery. During both partitions, women were viewed as symbols of the states that were being divided. Culture was tied to land, and so the loss of land was akin to losing a piece of your culture. Women were known as the culture bearers of their communities because they were symbols of a family's purity and honor. When land was broken up into multiple countries, women were blamed for this separation because they symbolized the land and the culture that was lost due to partition. In this way, the violence that was done to women was representative of the frustrations felt when losing family land. Most of this violence was conducted by men, and they took out their anger through sexual violence and bodily mutilations. In this way, they were harming women as a physical manifestation of the land that they lost due to partition. During these times of mass violence, women and girls were very nervous. In the 1947 partition, Biti Roy, a young girl at this time, was barred from going to school. She wasn't allowed to step out of her main house because the elders were worried about girls being abducted. Roy also notes that a number of girls cannot be found. Some of the abducted girls were found after 3 or 4 days, but not every girl was found. These quotes demonstrate the pervasive fear that women and girls felt about living during this time, and shows how common the practice of kidnapping actually was. In these circumstances, women lost most of their freedom of movement because of this large amount of violence taking place. When women did talk about the violence that occurred, they would speak in soft voices and wouldn't go to the police station to complain because they were scared of retaliation for them or their families. Violence against women was therefore a way to scare women and a way for men to funnel their anger by ruining a woman's perceived purity, creating an emotional release for men due to the loss of land at the expense of these women. And as a way to combat the mass violence, many women actually tried to commit suicide in order to retain the honor and purity that would be lost if sexual violence did occur. There was one big case during the 1947 partition in a city called Kilachand, located in what is now Pakistan. About 90 women ended up committing suicide by throwing themselves into wells to escape this violence. One example is of a woman named Basan Kaur, who attempted suicide with 2 of her daughters. Kara ended up surviving because she says that the well filled up and she and her daughters couldn't drown. The women that did drown became a source of pride in their communities because they sacrificed themselves so that their communities could retain their honor. Although Kara didn't drown, she too became respected in the community because she at least tried to help them retain their honor. So in these cases where women committed suicide, it was as if a woman who was dead but still considered pure was more valuable than a woman who was alive but went through this violence. And although these women did consciously choose to make this decision, with the added pressures of these social factors of honor and purity, this pushed a lot of women into thinking that suicide was the best decision. Many women that were exposed to the violence of both partitions ended up being abducted and were raped. When governments began looking for these women that were kidnapped to bring them back to their families, they found a lot of them living with their kidnappers and any children they might have had during this time. Problems arose when deciding what to do with these children and what the women should do if they were pregnant. In the partition of 1947, stringent policies about abortion were put into place, which were called cleansings, where many women were forced by the state to give up their children or get an abortion when they didn't want to terminate the pregnancy. In the partition of 1971, the state of Bangladesh actually tried to give women more bodily autonomy by allowing abortions if women wanted to get one. But this plan was never executed properly, and women were treated as a collective. And so many women would end up getting an abortion when they didn't want one, or they wanted an abortion and were barred from getting one. Abortions were also only allowed for women who were early on in their pregnancies, so women who were found by the state while late in their pregnancies had to go to full term. When children were already present, many mothers were forced to give up their children by either leaving them with the man that kidnapped them or putting their children up for adoption. This was because many women were given the ultimatum where they would be either be brought back to their families or they'd have to stay with their kidnappers and children. And if the women tried to bring their kids back to their families, it wasn't guaranteed that they would be accepted back because most of the time the families would not welcome these women back with illegitimate children. So this process gave more of a say to these women's families in the state than it did to the women. In 1971, as women were returning to the families after kidnappings, they were sent to government facilities to get medically checked out, where they received the name Birangonas. This was an attempt to restore these women's honor so that they wouldn't be subjected to any judgment from their families. And though this plan seemed good in theory, what actually happened was that women were thrust into the spotlight when many wanted their experiences to remain private. When they got married after a kidnapping, they were usually subject to more violence from their husband and his family because they knew about the violence that occurred. And although the name Birangona was meant to valorize these women, the name itself brought more attention to what these women went through, which brought more attention to these concepts of honor and purity that were meant to be destigmatized. So therefore, women tended to be one of the main targets for violence during both the 1947 and 1971 partitions because of their symbolism to honor and purity. Because of this relation, women tend to lose some part of their agency, which can be categorized into these four subjects: the symbolism of women's bodies, mass suicides, motherhood, and a return to familial communities after kidnappings and sexual violence had occurred. I wanted to end this presentation with this quote: "Women should not be treated as someone else's history or even not history at all. Although these stories can be hard to listen to, it's important to remember these women and to not let their stories become extinct before we lose an essential part of what happened during these time periods." Thank you for listening.
We now have a couple minutes just for asking and answering some questions. So if you have any questions regarding Gabby's presentation. Me and Rick.
Yeah, so this name, you could go a few slides back if you want. Birangona. One, what does it mean, if you know?
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
two, how was it applied to them? Was it just like what they called the victims? Did it become their like last name or something? Like, just could you explain that for us?
Yes, so Birangona means war heroine. And this was given after women were at these medical facilities after any sort of kidnapping or sexual violence occurred. And it was meant to valorize these women, so to basically destigmatize what they went through. But in the end, what actually happened was it kind of put a target on them because they were singled out as, oh, these events happened to me, when many didn't want to be known.
So did it become part of their names, or did the state just refer to them with that?
The state just referred to them as those names.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if this was both religions that were doing this, you know, a
Yes.
culture of both religions
Yes,
equally?
yes,
They
yeah.
were doing it.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Gabby, this is such great work. I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on, I was thinking about your end quote about history and kind of what you learned by doing this project about practice of history and what history has and hasn't been good at showing us?
Yeah, I think what I've learned the most and what I kind of knew but was just more reiterated in this presentation and in my research was that history tends to overlook people of color and women. And so that's kind of the main reason why I wanted to bring these stories to the forefront. So many that I learned while doing my research that were very harrowing but also really important to listen to.
Check time real quick. Yeah, we have.
This was really interesting, thank you. I feel like in a lot of historical studies, information like this is usually covered up or there's some attempt to keep it from the public eye because it's so harrowing. So did you have any issues with source material or was it freely available?
Yeah, I did have some trouble, especially finding first-person accounts. I was able to go to the British Library and listen to some stories, and I was able to find a journal online that was translating these women's stories. But I actually did come across a lot of times in articles where authors would say that a lot of these women's stories couldn't be found because some of the times in these medical facilities when they were going to be checked out, their stories just got erased. Like there was documentation and then it was just not there anymore.
I think we can take maybe one more question. If not, we could give Gabby another round of applause.